Liga forale. Iku bloj po Rusula Rusiu. Holaka holala, halagu.
Howdy, and welcome back to America's favorite half-hour Filman program, Filman. I'm Dan, your host, and it is a warm, late winter or early spring day here in Burlington, depending on whether you agree with the groundhog, but either way, I'm happy for the mini heat wave. It's been a good chance to walk around the city, and it just looks lovely out there. It's blue skies. And it's crazy to say that today we are discussing, in tier list form, the third highest globally grossing director of all time, only behind Steven Spielberg and the Russo brothers, and just nearly edging out Michael Bay and James Cameron. This director is none other than the cinematic pride and joy of New Zealand, Peter Jackson. Famous probably most for the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but I don't think the true depth of his career is widely known by a global audience, and certainly not an American one, because I can pretty clearly cut his career into three lengthy and distinct phases spanning the past 35 years. And a quick background on Peter Jackson first. Peter Jackson always grew up loving films in New Zealand, especially those films of Ray Harryhausen, which you may know for his iconic stop-motion monsters in films like the Sinbad movies, Jason and the Argonauts, that's the one I grew up with, 1 Million Years BC, and Clash of the Titans. He, like most kids in the 60s and 70s, got into filmmaking with a Super 8 camera that was given to him as a gift. And, you know, like any of us might have done with the gift of a film camera, that's something I got when I was like 9 myself. You made little movies with your friends. You tried to, recreate the 1933 King Kong with stop-motion models, because, kid stuff. And that is something Peter Jackson did. And the recurring theme of King Kong being a really big part of his life as one of his favorite movies will continue moving forward. But Jackson apparently showed a passion for film early on in his life, and he also never had much formal training when starting off, and learned apparently through a lot of trial and error, which is maybe one of the most admirable traits of Peter Jackson. He is one of the most, if not the most, successfully self-trained filmmakers of all day. I mean, back in the origins of film, everyone was kind of self-taught. I mean, there were no film schools, there wasn't a set way of film creation. It was just people with cameras thinking of things, and that was it. So there's something so admirable about self-taught filmmakers these days, because it just feels like there is such a unique and undisturbed creative spark that shows through on all of their films, and this is so true of Peter Jackson. When he was 16, Jackson left school and began working full-time as a photo engraver for a Wellington newspaper, the Evening Post. For 7 years, he worked there, lived with his parents, saved money for film equipment, bought a 16mm camera, and began shooting a film that later became 1987's Bad Taste. And this brings us to the first phase of his film career, affectionately titled, in my opinion, The Come Up, 1987 to 1997. For this first decade, he makes 5 films, and the first of which is 1987's Bad Taste. It's a comedy horror film about a bumbling government bureau tasked with defeating the impending alien invasion, and these specific aliens want to harvest people for food. Along with many of the films that he makes during this era, it's considered a splatter film, which is kind of a subgenre of horror films that leans heavily on graphic depictions of gore and violence. I wouldn't call this film offensive by any means, but it definitely is a bit gratuitous and stomach-churning at times. And when I say at times, I really only mean a culmination of shots that make up maybe 5% of the movie. But this trait is often softened by the fact that this is indeed a comedy film, and a pretty well-crafted deadpan comedy at that. Another influence and favorite of Peter Jackson's growing up was Monty Python's Flying Circus. And even after watching every Peter Jackson film up to this point, I can still say his debut is still one of my favorites, and maybe the most palatable of the first bloody, gory phase of his career. Peter Jackson himself plays 2 different characters throughout the film, one where he has a beard and the other where he's shaved. And this is ridiculously effective in throwing me off, because I had no idea really what he looked like before maybe 2008. I don't know. At that point, he's older, and he always has the beard. But here in Bad Taste, he's so thin and young, and he really looks like someone else. It's a really surprisingly good casting for, an indie film that you kind of just make with your friends. And not only does he play two people, there's a scene where those two characters fight each other on a cliff. And I think this is the point where I have to mention that this is one of my biggest notes on this movie, one of my biggest takeaways from watching this. This feels like one of the greatest and most effective indie films of all time. And I mean that. And I'm talking about indie in the true, honest sense of the term. Indie as in independent, to the point that you barely have any budget, only your friends are acting in it. The director plays two different characters and shoots a lot of the movie himself as well, and you've never had any formal training in filmmaking. That's what Bad Taste is. And the fact that the visual tricks and the editing and the practical effects are this inventive culminates into just a very historically relevant film. So if you want to see indie filmmaking at its near peak, if you want to see the film that made Peter Jackson's future producer quit his job to manage Peter Jackson, if you want a full-length first feature that debuted at the Cannes Film Festival and was immediately sold to 12 countries for distributing rights, watch Bad Taste. This is one hell of a film. I mean, I'm going to give this film the W tier for worth a watch. And after a glowing review like that, you may think, why isn't it higher? And I can't help but remind myself that each of these tier lists comes often with the bias of my prior knowledge of the filmmaker. And knowing what Peter Jackson would go on to do, it's hard to place this one any higher. But it is one of the highest W tier films I've ever placed on a tier list. Some other notes on the movie, it definitely has moments where it drags, but overall, it is only 91 minutes. It's a pretty short watch. The performances are fun and campy, and he would go on to have cameo roles for his friends in future films of his. The ending is pretty impressive, and I don't want to spoil it too much, but it's out of this world. But I've mentioned the movies about aliens, so you can just imagine what happens at the end. I won't tell you, but that's a semi-spoiler. Plus, the backdrop of Jackson's home of New Zealand and just a coastal cliffside town that this movie takes place in is beautiful, and it's something as a filmmaker he utilizes as one of the best traits of his career, even from day one. I mean, I watch this movie, and I watch any of his movies, and what other filmmaker from New Zealand has not only shown off New Zealand's beauty, but also made films like the ones he's made? A few people can claim the kinds of stunning and just effortless views that Peter Jackson was just born into. I mean, he just needed to pick up a camera and he captured this. And what's cool is he brings that to a global audience throughout his career, and it's really cool. So, W, worth a watch. Another thing I love about Peter Jackson in his early phase of his career is his overall unpredictability as, I guess, to the kind of film he'll make and how he'll go about telling the story of that film. And I think he's kept that throughout his career for the most part, but he's really jumping around early on in these first years. And this next movie is no exception. We're talking about 1989's Meet the Feebles, a dark splatter comedy, somewhat, about a clear Muppets ripoff variety show and the dark, seedy backdrop that it exists on top of. And this film is truly something else. It is similarly gratuitous in the ways that maybe Bad Taste is, but much more consistent. But instead of the props or set pieces, it is the characters that are truly the most gratuitous. I mean, every Muppet character in this film is the worst possible version of whatever stereotype they are set into. If we're talking about this cast, you have the power-hungry manager, businessman of the Feebles, this kind of live variety hour show, which is a walrus that lies and cheats everyone just to win. And you have his girlfriend, who is a Miss Piggy knockoff, and the drama queen star of the show. You have the strung out and paranoid Bugs Bunny knockoff host, the little fly that buzzes around looking for news for the gossip column, a PTSD-stricken stunt frog, and you have the naive newcomer Robert, who's a hedgehog, who is very cute most times and a little annoying other times, as he serves as our protagonist. You know, he comes in as like the person who's the longtime fan of the show, but once he starts working there, he quickly discovers its dark truth when working there. And we also have his beautiful, innocent love interest, a Pomeranian named Lucille, who's another newcomer in this ensemble cast, I guess, all together, weaves in between storylines, all in preparation for that night's live show. So, you know, this is overall a deeply misanthropic film. And when it plays that for laughs and shock comedy for the whole time, it can be hard to swallow, I'll admit that. But it's still impeccably well crafted. And definitely funny at times, because you are in the world of the Feebles from beginning to end. I mean, the production is well done. It's uniquely scaled with so many different sized animal puppets interacting throughout the theater backstage backdrop. And the puppets even enter real life situations as well, like shooting in like parking lots, shipping docks, or golf courses. And yet the puppets, those are the only characters we ever see. There are no humans in this world. And it does make for a very trippy experience overall, because it takes the traditionally beloved youth entertainment imagery of puppets and really turns it into a raunchy, again, gratuitous, nearly, I think, X-rated film. Like, if not for the fact they are puppets and not real people. Like, if we saw what we were shown in this film as real people doing these things, it would be banned somewhere. It would, I know it. It would definitely not be able to be shown in many places. So there's a lot going into this one, and I guess I give it a V tier for very average. You know, I mean, it's Peter Jackson's first honest deep dive into shock horror a little bit, and also playing way more with practical costumes and effects that you end up seeing in the rest of his career. I mean, this is something he's worked with on Bad Taste. He ramps it up way more with Meet the Feebles, and he'll just continue to have that be like a really regular trend in his films. So, we're going to take a quick PSA break, and we will continue on with the next couple films of Peter Jackson's career.
Running late to class but still need that morning caffeine or hot breakfast to start your day out right? Download the Bite app by Sodexo and place your custom order for fast, easy pickup at Zyme. Open 8:30 a.m. to 3 o'clock p.m. Mondays through Fridays.
All right, welcome back to Film And. We are doing a Peter Jackson tier list, all the movies he has directed from 1987 to present, and we are coming in now on 1992's Brain Dead, rebranded as Dead Alive for an American distribution. And I will actually start my thoughts on this film off with saying what the tier is. I usually wait till the end. I'm going to say at the beginning, I begrudgingly give it a T tier for terrible. I don't like doing that, but I feel like I must. I mean, part of me wants to take it back a bit because, to be honest, it deserves the T tier for good and bad reasons. So let me just kind of just take that back real quick, actually. Brain Dead is not only Peter Jackson's third film, but it is also considered to be one of the absolute goriest films of all time. Total Film actually ranks it at number 1, and I am not surprised. I mean, this is the goriest film I've ever seen, mostly for the second half, but there's plenty of gore peppered throughout the entire film. But consider this. It is ranked above the first Saw film, Hellraiser, Lucio Fulci's Zombie Flesh Eaters, High Tension, and Tetsuo the Iron Man. I mean, those are high balls to pass, and I'm not kidding when I say this film is for iron stomachs. And let me remind you who we are talking about here. This is Peter Jackson, the director of Lord of the Rings. Certainly not devoid of gory elements itself, but that's a deeply graceful series of movies that at times portrays the beauty and simple joys of Middle-earth, these sweeping landscapes. And only 8 years before, he is becoming known for splatter films, shock horror, and dark comedy. And this is one of the absolute goriest films of all time. I mean, there's something to be said for that. Quick synopsis for you all out there who haven't heard of Brain Dead. When a Sumatran rat monkey bites Lionel Cosgrove's mother, she transforms into a zombie and begins killing and transforming the entire town, while Lionel races to keep things under control. What is really ingenious about this film is that it really runs as more of a cleaned up and nuanced take on a zombie film, where it leans into a couple tropes but doesn't sacrifice the story at any point. The first half is a really intriguing story. It's got fun visuals to go along with it, good performances by the two leads, and they all love interests, and they have a very nice chemistry. And the slight gore elements and zombie aspects of the film are much more turned down, but it's not until you reach the final scene, and you don't even realize it's the final scene until you're deep into it, that things really spin out of control. And the pacing of this film is probably what I admire most. I mean, it is a tight, rigid edit to the opening scenes of this film. And the story progresses quite unassumingly, but it's entertaining enough to keep it on. But little by little, these things exponentially fall out of control. Scene by scene, moment by moment, and each time you think you've reached the climax of gore, the next one will indeed be crazier than the previous, I can promise you. And like I said, this is exponential growth. It's not a steady ramp up to something crazy like a lot of movies do. If this were on the crazy scale of 1 to 10, let's say, it goes from 1 to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32 to 64 to 128 to 83 quadrillion, okay? And then the movie just ends. And if you haven't turned it off or somewhat kept yourself from vomiting in the wastebasket that's next to you, you deserve a medal or something, all right? Because this thing is... it's... This is tough, man. This is so hard to talk about because I can't just, it's so gory. That's all I can say. There's just blood and guts and limbs, and there's a lawnmower that's chopping it. Oh, man, it's, I mean, the sound design that comes across all of this really is what brings it all home. But listen to me. The T tier does not mean I am unimpressed with this movie at all. I mean, I am, but this thing's an intentionally gut-churning film. And it's a kind of film you can't unsee. I mean, watch this one on a dare. Or if you just love cinema, this is one for the history books. I guarantee it. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I want to take this time when I'm talking about this movie to kind of mention that Peter Jackson, so early on in his career, was already making a name for himself by creating one of the absolute goriest films in all of horror history. And all within the fun package of Peter Jackson's unique style of filmmaking. I mean, whether you're talking about, like, the graveyard scene with the, I guess, kung fu ass-kicking priest who comes in and fights some zombies, the house party scene, it's also a 50s period piece. He does back-to-back 50s period pieces. We'll get to the second one right after, but this one is very different from the next. There's a 50s house party that kind of turns south and into a bit of a zombie party. And all of just the set design of the main mansion where the mother and the son live when she gets bit by the Sumatran rat monkey, and how he deals with it and how the house kind of falls into disarray is just really visually intriguing. And that's, to go back to my previous point, I don't think that's something I've really talked about yet. I mean, Peter Jackson does indeed have a unique style of filmmaking. Namely, he has this really effective use of handheld, natural, lighthearted, and comedic inserts into his set design and script and just overall production. His use of puppets and practical costume effects, like the aliens in Bad Taste, the human-sized animals of Meet the Feebles, and the devil baby and other zombie creatures of Brain Dead. I mean, all these things tend to make Jackson's films stand out from the rest of those working within these genres and within these budgets as well. I mean, when you watch a Peter Jackson film, no matter, it is so resourceful and inventive, and that's what keeps me going through the dark, bloody pit that films like Brain Dead occupy. It's Peter Jackson through and through, and I love that. But moving on, we have easily the most atypical and unexpected left turn of Peter Jackson's career so far. This one threw me through a loop for a bit. We're talking about 1994's Heavenly Creatures, another 50s period drama, second in a row, about the romance of two young women and their struggles with fitting into the strict 1950s British Commonwealth society. I mean, this is where Peter Jackson's self-taught aesthetics in filmmaking is really turned up a notch. I mean, he hasn't lost his specific style. his unwavering control of handheld, or his little injections of comedy and horror, which we have established all kind of his two major genres at this point. Here, everything just feels cleaned up and more professionally made. I mean, it still feels like Peter Jackson, but he's improved his dynamic visual storytelling. And it seems he's just working with a bigger budget. You know, Braindead was roughly $3 million to make. I'm sure $2 million of those dollars went to just blood and guts. But this is Heavenly Creatures' $5 million budget. So Melanie Lynskey and Kate Winslet star, a very young Kate Winslet. This is like one of her first leading films. They star as the two young women in question, and they really fall into their characters so well, you know, and their distinctive dichotomy really separates this film from other teen drama period pieces. Is that a genre? Teen drama period pieces? I'm not sure. I feel like that might be a genre. I don't know. But anyways, there are plenty of fun little things about this movie. Like Kate Winslet's dad leaving an egg and salmon sandwich in his pocket for like a week and not really caring about it. Or just a montage about 20 minutes in while Kate Winslet and Melanie Lynskey are becoming friends. Kate Winslet annoys a homeless man while she's fawning over Italian tenor singer Mario Lanza. And the homeless man is portrayed by Peter Jackson. A fun cameo. You can look up a video of all the Peter Jackson cameos in film, and they're really fun. He also has one in Braindead, too. He's a funeral service assistant, and again, he has a shaved face, and this is, I think, the last confirmed time I can say he shaved. In 1992, he shaved at least then, 30 years ago. Yeah, I do appreciate that there's these lighter moments, these comedic moments that kind of all inserted just into this story, because it ends up becoming a pretty dark retelling, because this is actually based on a true story. It's a pretty dark retelling of these two women's young lives. And, you know, the animated special effects of his past films also make small appearances. Melanie Lynskey's character, Pauline, makes these clay figurines in like this kind of medieval dream that she's creating, this medieval world that she creates with Kate Winslet's character. And at many times we see the almost live-action visualization of these clay figures when she enters her imagination. And they are like life-size people in like clay plastic brown outfits where it looks like they're statues, but they're moving because like they're rubbery and talking. And it's so trippy. It's so weird, but it's just so interesting. It's so unique, you know, taking that approach of like showing the audience what that imagination place looks like for them. And also, there's a point when the two women, Juliet and Pauline, are visiting a beach, and Peter Jackson pushes the camera directly into a sandcastle that they've made. And when it bursts through the door of the sandcastle, we see a real like castle kind of made of sand with all sorts of intricacies and winding staircases until it kind of dumps back out on a tower window in the black sand beach they're on. Again, it's this visual creativity that makes most Peter Jackson films just a treat to watch. You could have just shown the girls imagining the story of the sandcastle they built, but no, we actually get to see the interior in a super creative use of special practical effects. And here, I think above most other moments, it shows that Peter Jackson cares about the film experience. I mean, this is a story about imagination and escapism and the relationship that forms within that kind of unbridled creativity in the restrictive social realities of New Zealand in the 50s. And Peter Jackson allows us to enjoy the ride with coming up on so many creative solutions to every single scene. And now he's just doing it at such a high level. It's really just, again, admirable. Pauline, Melanie Lynskey's character, serves as the protagonist since her character's actual unedited real-life journal entries serve as the narration of the film. And, you know, her outcast nature paired with Juliet's distant parents and their restrictive school environment really pushes them together to fall deeper into this imaginary world that they create. And I gotta say, you're falling with them right at the same time. And it's something else to watch. I mean, the overall somewhat violent conclusions they form due to the societal pressures placed on them does leave the audience with a weird note to end this film on. But I guess it is closer to the historical events that the film portrays, but it does still rub me the wrong way a bit. I mean, it's not a perfect movie. The story itself flows so well, and it's cool to mention that this film got an Academy Award nomination for Best Original Screenplay. That's cool. But I have my issues with how the film sometimes overplays certain characters for the sake of drama, perhaps, and it is an emotional roller coaster, and it's not exactly one I don't think I can just ride at any time. So it's pretty good, but not amazing. Overall, Peter Jackson turns what should be a pretty paint-by-numbers drama with an above-average script into a multi-dimensional piece of cinema that makes you cry and laugh and retch and sigh and scream. I mean, just like all protagonists, Pauline and Juliet. You're going through the wide spectrum of emotions that the characters all right with them. This is also the first instance of Peter Jackson's iconic helicopter shots where he shows off the beautiful landscape of New Zealand, something he will go on to do quite effectively in future movies. Wink, wink. So overall, W tier, worth a watch. And we have now come to the end of what I would say is the first leg of Peter Jackson's career. In 1996's The Frighteners sees Peter Jackson breaking through to a larger budget of $5 million to $26 million, and a larger audience than ever, with the title called Robert Zemeckis Presents at the beginning of the film probably being the most notable backer of his directorial style to date. I mean, not to mention the star power of Michael J. Fox serving as this film's lead, and this is one of his last major roles of his career. So we've reached Peter Jackson's final film of the 90s, and it is 1996's The Frighteners. And a note on Michael J. Fox right here. This is kind of considered his last major film role, at least on screen, as the following 6 or 7 years held plenty of voice roles for him, But synopsis. The Frighteners tells the story of Frank Bannister, Michael J. Fox, an architect who develops psychic abilities allowing him to see, hear, and communicate with ghosts. After losing his wife, he uses his new abilities by cheating customers out of money for his ghost hunting business. Air quotes. However, a mass murderer comes back from hell, prompting Frank to investigate the supernatural presence, and things ensue. Events transpire. Fox's performance did receive critical praise. A lot of people enjoyed it quite a bit, and Kenneth Turin of the LA Times wrote, "The film's actors are equally pleasing. Both Fox, in his most successful starring role in some time, and Trini Alvarado have no difficulty getting into the manic spirit of things." And I'll say this film does kind of feel like Paranorman, if Paranorman became Paranorman 30 years into his life. If I can give a mini description for modern audiences. Contextually, that's kind of what it's like. He has the same relationship with ghosts as Paranorman does. But yeah, I mean, on the topic of Michael J. Fox's character, Frank Bannister, my favorite part of the movie. I mean, I always forget what an engaging leading man he makes in a film, and he really sells his character's life, backstory, and just drives the film forward in general. And thank goodness, because, I mean, there isn't too much else in this film to be excited about. I mean, as for Peter Jackson, it seems we have truly reached the threshold of his production style, getting really close into transforming into what we would see in Lord of the Rings. And I think it also serves as a film that Peter Jackson uses to start to play around with the use of CGI and ghosts, something I think he familiarizes himself with in this post-edit process and then begins to perfect in his following films. And this is also the last horror film of his career to date. It would be interesting to see what else he'd do if he ever came back to the genre, but for now, this is his final entry. And despite everything this movie does have going for it, it also seems like this movie, among most, is an Americanized version of a Peter Jackson film. There are more predictable and less edgy, like Hollywood jokes of people destroying long gnomes and annoying neighbors in tracksuits, threatening to sue, and like floating babies and Elvis figurines. And this is probably where the film suffers the most, because it's losing some of the charm of Peter Jackson's unique sense of humor and settling for pretty poorly aged 90s family-friendly humor, mostly based off of visual effects that aren't achievable because the technology just isn't there. And granted, the effects are done by Peter Jackson's Weta Digital, which had only been created 3 years prior, and they would spend the next years really perfecting their style, but here it's very raw, and well, they did the best they could, I'll say that. Even if they don't hold up like at all today, I mean, Jackson always takes such a practical approach with his visual effects that makes sense from the biggest directors to any audience member. And it's really cool to see him working in that mode at such a high level, you know, these pretty cool, understandable, practical effects. Something even as similar as just overlaying strips of film over each other. So it's a shame to see that Jackson's first kind of Hollywood film doesn't go over as well as I'd hoped. But it seems Jackson is just less present in places he should be, like particularly the editing booth. But there are some great aspects of the script. You know, the one line delivered to Michael J. Fox's character from the ghost friend, the judge, "Death's no way to make a living." Fantastic. And I do want to say, there is something to be said about the planning of this film that leaves the concept feeling disjointed. Jackson and his life partner and co-writer on all of his films, Fran Walsh, conceived the idea for The Frighteners during a scriptwriting phase of Heavenly Creatures. And executive producer Robert Zemeckis hired the duo to write the script with the original intention that he himself would direct it, kind of as like a spin-off film of the television series Tales from the Crypt. And when you hear that, and then you watch the movie, it makes much more sense that that is kind of the creative through line that's existing. But Zemeckis believed the film would be better off directed by Jackson, produced by Zemeckis, and distributed by Universal Studios. And I don't know, it feels much more like a collaboration, but some of the best parts of Peter Jackson are left out. So overall, I give it a V tier, very average. You know, it's not terrible. There's some really cool, fun parts to this movie, but overall, some things don't age great because it's just the visuals and the technology isn't there. And the story and characters can kind of falter at times. And folks, this is where we close out the episode. I mean, with the first 5 films of Peter Jackson's career and his horror movie splatter era. But before I finish up this week's episode, I do want to give a little context on what happens next. The Frighteners was regarded as a box office failure. On a budget of $26 million, it made $29 million. And film critic Roger Ebert expressed disappointment, stating that incredible effort has resulted in a film that looks more like a demo reel than a movie. In February '97, Jackson launched legal proceedings against the New Zealand Listener magazine for defamation over a review of The Frighteners, which claimed that the film was built from the rubble of other people's movies. And in the end, the case was not pursued further. I mean, around this time, Jackson's remake of King Kong, which he had been working on for a while, was shelved by Universal Studios, partly because Mighty Joe Young and Godzilla, both giant monster movies that had already gone into production, were kind of taking up the yearly slot. And this period of transition seems to not have been entirely a happy one. But it also marked one of the high points of tension between Jackson and the New Zealand Film Commission, since Meet the Feebles had gone way over budget earlier in his career. Jackson has claimed that the commission considered firing him from Feebles, though they went on to help fund his next 3 films. In '97, the director submitted a lengthy criticism of the commission for a magazine supplement that was meant to celebrate the body's 20th anniversary, but instead criticized what he called inconsistent decision-making by inexperienced board members, which is ballsy, I feel. So tensions are high, and we're entering 1997, and Peter Jackson is in a bit of a shaky place in his career, but this is exactly when things start to fall into place for what I would say is the second leg. Because in 1997, he was able to win the rights to film J.R.R. Tolkien's 3-book epic, Lord of the Rings. And originally he worked with Miramax Films towards a 2-film production. And God, imagine if Lord of the Rings was 2 films. But Jackson was later pressured to render the story as a single film, and finally overcame a tight deadline by making a last-minute deal with New Line Cinema, who were keen on a trilogy. And that is where we will pick up on part 2 of my Peter Jackson tier list. But right now, I have a plane to catch. Because yes, I'm on my way to the exotic and sunshiny Indiana to go and record the 3rd annual Andes with Connor, which will be coming out next week, so tune in for that. It will be a great time. If you want to check out any of the movies we've talked about on Film And, all of them are posted on the Letterboxd Film And list, and my Letterboxd is DA_N. And if you want to look at any movies we talked about in the first full seasons of Film And, you can go to Connor's Letterboxd at Cranberry18. That is CRAND Berry 18. That's all I have for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and I'm very excited for the Andes. So you will be hearing from me and Connor next week. See ya.